Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Sister Jacinta from the Department of Philosophy and Theology, and we welcome you. So it's an honor to introduce my colleague, Dr. Adam DeVille. He's an associate professor of theology and has served our department and the university in a variety of ways, now as our director of humanities. Dr. DeVille also serves as editor-in-chief of Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian studies. He has written on East-West church relations and the promotion of Christian unity. Most importantly, this evening, Dr. DeVille will share with us insights from his new book that's titled Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power. In doing so, he draws from history and tradition, from theology and psychology, to propose structures that are practical and that foster accountability. Dr. DeVille has had a number of interviews about his new book, but this is his first opportunity to speak about it on our campus in our lecture series since it came out last spring. He will have copies of his book available for purchase afterwards, right up here. So please welcome to the podium Dr. Adam DeVille.
Thank you, Sister. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see many familiar faces and others whom I hope to get to know this evening.
Yes.
I have, in thinking about the history today, been writing about the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church since 1992 in my native Canada. I was in St. John's, Newfoundland in the late 1980s when the first major report was handed down detailing abuses at the Mount Cashel Orphanage, a church-run place of unrelenting darkness and evil that destroyed thousands of young lives and led to numerous suicides, addictions, failed marriages, and other trauma. As an undergraduate in 1992, I wrote my first paper on the response of the Canadian bishops to a crisis that spread from Newfoundland in the east all the way across to engulf the entire country. The Episcopal response in 1992 was as useless as anything we have seen anywhere else in the world since. That was 27 years ago, and I am now 47. So for all of my adult and academic life, sex abuse in the Catholic Church has been front and center. Nevertheless, after an Anglican upbringing, I joined the Catholic Church in 1997, doing so with my eyes wide open, and as my sponsor and friend Mark Cameron said to me, a bucket in my hand to help bail out the bark of Peter. But the water of abuse kept rising. Here in these rebel colonies of Her Britannic Majesty, Boston in 2002 would mark for many the beginning of the real crisis in this country. But since 2018, we have learned to call Boston merely the first wave of what is now a relentless tsunami washing over the shores of the Church in every land on earth. Today we have seen massive abuse emerge in Australia, Chile, Honduras, Germany, much of Africa, and as recently as Monday of this week, in the Vatican itself. I have been saying for the last 18 months that this is a crisis everyone in this room who is my age and older will not see the end of before we die. To borrow Churchill's phrase in 1942 after the Battle of El Alamein, my descendants may yet live to see the end of the beginning of this crisis, but it will leave long-term trauma in the body of Christ, and none of us will see the real end of that. Perhaps my children or their children may catch glimpses of a renewed church decades and decades hence, but there are no guarantees of that. I have also been saying over the last 18 months, at first tentatively, but with growing evidence now, that the response to the crisis is this time different. From 1992 until 2018, I detected a clear and consistent response on the part of most Catholics, myself included. That response went something like this. Yes, these stories are bad, but it's just a few rotten apples, and we need simply to fling them from the barrel and perhaps await a new bishop or two, and presto, the Pope will make the Church great again. Well, with the death of John Paul II in 2005 and the almost immediate opening of an investigation by his successor into the demonic and evil priest Marcel Maciel, head of the Legionaries, who abused seminarians, abused boys, abused girls, abused his own children, fathered by 3 different women, a man whom John Paul II had protected and promoted as he had others, including Theodore McCarrick. When all of this began to emerge slowly, very slowly, over the last 15 years, and very reluctantly, some people started to shift ever so slightly to think that perhaps the idea of the Pope making the Church great again was a little misplaced. But hey, doesn't every saint make at least one mistake? But then we learned that it wasn't just one mistake, but many, and often repeated in the same place twice. More than a decade ago now, I wrote an article and published it, pointing out that John Paul II appointed 2 bishops in succession to the same diocese, Palm Beach, Florida. His appointees, namely Bishop Joseph Simmons, who resigned in 1998, and his successor, Anthony O'Connell, who resigned in 2002, both did so after admitting to sexually abusing boys and seminarians. Subsequently, we have seen other bishops appointed, promoted, and praised by John Paul II, by Benedict XVI, and by Francis. Bishops who have later been unmasked as abusers, or as those who have aided and abetted abuse by hiding abusers, covering up abuse, stonewalling law enforcement, spending millions of dollars to thwart investigations and to lobby against changing statute of limitations laws, and other malevolent actions designed solely to protect their own powers, perks, and privileges. All of this seems to have come to a head in the summer of 2018, when the news of Theodore McCarrick broke. That was the moment after which I began to detect a real change in the response of Catholics around the world. What is different after 2018 is that most Catholics have increasingly come to abandon that infantile and magical thinking which leads them to assume the Pope is going to swoop down and make things better. Increasingly, the man in white is no longer seen as the great bearer of band-aids for the boo-boos of the Church around the world. Most people today realize we're not dealing with just a few bad apples in the parishes or a few terrible episcopal appointments, but a corrupt and complicit hierarchy around the world, from the local bishop all the way up to and including the popes of Rome themselves. We now see that this crisis has revealed a systemic structure of mendacity and malevolence, which is sustained by a monopoly on power we have never before seriously examined or challenged. Hitherto, most Catholics have lived under the illusion, in the strict Freudian sense of wish fulfillment, that Daddy, Papa, the so-called Holy Father in Rome, is going to fix everything, including the few bad bishops that somehow managed to escape the supposedly solicitous eyes of his papal predecessors. That has been changing over the last 18 months and must continue to change in profound and far-reaching ways. Today, more and more people are waking up to the simple fact that there are over 5,000 bishops in the world today. And the idea that one man in Rome, whatever his name or whatever his supposed sanctity and intelligence are, cannot attempt to supervise them all. Today, every organizational expert on the planet will tell you that no meaningful supervision happens in any organization if you have more than about a dozen direct reports, as they're called. So the Church attempting to have one man supervise over 5,000 men is not just bad organizational psychology, it's abhorrent theology. In fact, there is no theology behind it. It's a fabrication produced out of whole cloth in the aftermath of the most unnecessary and the most mischievous council in Christian history, namely Vatican I. Before the end of that gathering in 1870 and the promulgation of the Code of Canon Law implementing it in 1917, the sickly infantile fantasies about the papacy grew rapidly. And one of these was that he was somehow supposed to be in charge of the whole Church, down to appointing all bishops everywhere, which no pope in history has ever attempted. The idea that he should have done so is a modern piece of nonsense that more and more Catholics today realize was and is a key component in the damage done and still being done to the Church in this sex abuse crisis without end. After 2018, then, Catholics are increasingly open to far-reaching changes across the entire Church, including the papacy. Increasingly gone, though alas by no means thoroughly eradicated yet, is the idea that the system as we have it is, well, it's largely fine. We just need, again, a few better priests and bishops and popes, and other than that, the Church is already great. For sane Catholics, that is no longer a belief on offer. What then is? So far, I must say the responses I've seen to the crisis have all been, at best, pathetic. A few tepid conferences at the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic University of America, and Georgetown where nothing serious or concrete was proposed or has since developed. A change in canon law by Pope Francis in June in a document titled Vos Estis, which has already proven, as I predicted in print that it would be, a total failure. A metropolitan model, so-called, proposed by the Archbishop of Chicago, also seen immediately as futile, as useless, and as self-serving as the papal change to canon law, and for all the same reasons. Bishop Robert Barron, who never misses a microphone or screen or chance to splash his ideas about, recently published a pamphlet purporting to address the crisis. It's the usual stew of self-serving cliches, deflection, demonization, and denunciation of any real concrete reforms in the Church, falling back in the end on a pathetic and transparently self-serving plea for Catholics to simply trust bishops more to keep on doing what they've been doing for so long, which of course is to preside over abuse while protecting their backs and living a cozy, cosseted life of self-regarding elites accountable in practice to nobody. If this man, regularly and tediously touted as the most media-savvy bishop on the U.S. bench, can only conjure up such sad drivel in his letter to a suffering church, then one can at long last understand the rage of the French Revolution against bishops and regard it as a quite rational reaction after all. But for those of us who may tend to scruple slightly at possible moral questions surrounding the mass guillotining of bishops, have we other options to hand? Here is where my book enters to propose the most far-reaching reforms anywhere on offer today. It is strong medicine, the strongest, in fact, for a body, the Church, which is dying from inaction and ineffective previous measures. Now, I am not, my rhetoric above notwithstanding, a natural revolutionary. I am by temperament, though certainly not in the terms of American politics, quite conservative. But the book is revolutionary, and you may well find things in there to disagree with. In fact, I would rather welcome that. But before telling you a bit about what it proposes, let me underscore two things about the book itself and its structure. First, it's a graduated revolution. There's a logic undergirding the book which is important to highlight here. The 5 chapters ascend in order of revolutionary change and in order of difficulty and cost. So I start with what would be the easiest, the least objectionable, the most readily supportable changes at the parish level, and only then move up through the diocese and the regional or national levels. And only in the very last chapter do I come to propose changes that would be the most far-reaching and difficult and involve the greatest degree of change for the largest number of people. Excuse me. In many ways, in fact, I would be perfectly happy with just the changes to parishes and dioceses. If they were implemented and the rest of the book ignored, the Church would already be well on her way to recovery of health and strength in significant degree. The second point that I really want to stress here is that these reforms, while being revolutionary, are also deeply traditional. They are deeply grounded within Catholic tradition. They're not just conjured up out of thin air. They're not generated after reading an HR manual of best practices. These are grounded within our own tradition. Everything that's argued in the book is grounded in earlier parts of Catholic history and in venerable practices forgotten by the West, but in some cases still kept alive today by the Eastern churches. My lodestar for my 2 books now has always been the great French Dominican theologian Yves Congar. In his 1950 landmark book, Vraies et fausses réformes dans l'Église, he speaks of what he calls la grande loi d'un réformisme catholique, the great law of Catholic reform. That law, he says, consists in un retour au principe de catholicisme. Il faudra d'abord interroger la tradition, se replonger en elle. It is necessary, he writes, to return to the tradition and to re-immerse oneself in it, understanding that tradition does not refer to what is past or passé or routine, but that tradition is alive and vital. And that's exactly what the book does. It returns to the riches of earlier Catholic tradition to interrogate that tradition, to show, for example, that everything about the current system and structure in which power is monopolized by priests in parishes, bishops in dioceses, and popes in the universal church is totally modernist and without support in tradition. The current system is profoundly untraditional and scarcely a century old. There is no historical or theological justification for priests to have a monopoly on decision-making powers in parishes. If we examine tradition, East and West, ancient and contemporary, we find that the bishop, being the sole agent of governance in a diocese, as the current system has it, is also without theological, psychological, or ecumenical support or appeal. These monopolies in parish and diocese must therefore change, but to what? In Chapter 2, I propose only a very modest change from current practice. Currently, a parish council, which many parishes have, some of you may have served on them, is optional. A parish council is merely optional. It's not required. My book argues that they must be mandatory. They must be required, first of all. Second, it argues they must be elected annually with term limits. Third, it argues that those councils must be empowered to have voice and vote in all matters of parish governance which they exercise together with the pastor. And fourth, they work with the bishop when the time comes for any reason for a change in pastoral leadership. At a stroke, this change cuts off the usual mechanism by which a bishop drops a new man into a parish and disappears the old one without telling anyone the reason for the change. That practice must go. That is the practice under which countless priests have been shuffled in and out of parishes to continue their abuse without anybody knowing about it. My proposal would see in its place the council and the bishop together discuss the need for a new pastor or an assistant pastor. And the council and the bishop frankly share, in a confidential session under oath, everything they know about the proposed candidates. No longer is a man's abusive past kept hidden in a file, a secret file known only to the bishop. If a pastor must be removed for any reason, the parish council must be told. And before a replacement is appointed by the bishop must solemnly swear to the council that he knows of no impediment against the appointment, that there is nothing, no past record of abuse, of being an alcoholic, or of embezzling funds from previous parishes in that man's personnel file. Then in Chapter 3, we propose similar changes for the same reasons, but at the next level up, the diocesan level. And here we call for recovering the annual or even biannual holding of synods with real voice and vote for all members whose responsibilities include election and legislation for the diocese, election of the bishop, passing of the budget, and putting forth of other relevant legislation. Synods are also a force and a place for an annual accounting to the diocese by the bishop of his stewardship over the past year, giving a chance for the people to question him closely in order to hold him accountable, not least by voting his budget up or down, while cutting off lines in that budget and pockets of money, slush funds in effect, that have been used to pay off abusers while silencing them with confidentiality clauses. Cutting off, moreover, the slush funds that allow bishops to live high on the hog, as we have seen most recently in West Virginia, though the practices there are by no means limited to that diocese. Synods, in fact, were a constant feature of the Church in the West, reiterated, re-emphasized after the Council of Trent, which called for them to be held twice a year. In that regard, Vatican II's reputation as being a kind of so-called progressive council is in fact misguided. It's regressive, because it downplayed the need for synods. And as a result, the instrument has rarely been used except as a means of consultation. Chapter 4, moving up to the next level, proposes similar reforms at the national or the regional levels, taking that peculiarly modern and highly problematic beast known as an Episcopal Conference and replacing it with a real functioning synod, one of whose jobs would be to act as a tribunal for the legal trial and deposition of bishops, deposing them from office if they are found guilty of abuse themselves or of covering up abuse. This would leave Rome as the court of final appeal, as an appellate court, which again, although nobody knows this, is a very ancient practice going back to the Council of Serdica in the year 343. Only in the very last chapter, for reasons very carefully laid out there, do I propose looking at the problems of celibacy, including a celibate episcopate. That, when you typically read your average journalist's accounting of the abuse crisis, is the thing that they jump to first, right? If only these guys could be married, then the problem would go away. Well, that, of course, is nonsense. I put this chapter last because the logic of the book, as I mentioned earlier, demanded it. A change in the requirement for celibacy among not just parish clergy, but even among bishops, would be the most disruptive and truly revolutionary. And as I mentioned before, I'm not a natural revolutionary. Moreover, having many friends in the Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches who are married priests, and being friends not just with them, but with their wives and children, I know the costs of what such changes would entail for the Latin Church. The idea that, as we heard recently at the so-called Amazon Synod in Rome, the Pope can just sort of snap his fingers and allow men to be married in the Church is, of course, just a romantic fantasy. Having a married clergy is a very sacrificial demand, and that's why I put it last, where it's very gingerly proposed and hedged about with many cautions and caveats. It's not something to enter into quickly or lightly, because it involves a lot of real sacrifice, and the people who would bear most of that sacrifice are not clergy. They are women and children, the wives and children of married clergy. And so, in fact, if the changes I just mentioned to parish councils, to diocesan and regional synods were implemented, and the changes in my last chapter on a celibate clergy were not, again, I think the Church would already be in vastly better shape, and we could leave it there. Now, any but perhaps cumulatively all of these proposed changes taken together will strike some Catholics as almost unthinkable. As I was writing the book, it became clear to me that one of the biggest blocks to the change in the Church today is psychological. Here I drew on the celebrated Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor and his work on social imaginaries to talk about what I called the Catholic imaginary. The modern Catholic imaginary, that is after 1870, is paralyzed by its infantile deference to the Pope. The expectation is created that nothing can be done without papal approval, and no changes are possible except those initiated by him, whom we must all not just follow, but fawn over. How else to explain, for example, the fact that John Paul's funeral in 2005 was the largest such gathering in history? How does one understand the millions who turn out for such events as World Youth Day? Nothing, and I mean nothing, at World Youth Day is unavailable at home. Sacraments, catechesis, fellowship, all this can be had in your parish or your diocese. The only purpose in going is, as those who have told me, to see the Pope. Not to see Jesus Christ or God the Father, but the Pope. If that isn't at least borderline idolatry, the term has no meaning. But of such is the Catholic imaginary after Vatican I composed. Now, as Taylor defines it, an imaginary is not an explicit social theory, but a tool that rules in or out certain types of permissible questions about our social existence. The idea of an imaginary, he says, centers on the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, and this is not expressed in theoretical terms, but carried in images, stories, and legends. Much, too much, of the modern papacy is built on faulty images, stories, and legends, not on serious theology. There is too much deliberate and intentional myth-making that surrounds the papacy. Too many sly and subtle extensions of papal power and influence, never made explicit, but always unconsciously exploited in the Catholic imaginary. Again, this is nowhere so clear as at and in the aftermath of Vatican I, as the Jesuit historian John O'Malley's recent book on that council makes clear. He argues there that Vatican I brought about a strikingly new prominence in Catholic consciousness for the ordinary believer focused on the Pope. Believers, he said, were led by the bishops of the council to think that personal devotion to the Pope became a new Catholic virtue. Following O'Malley, I argue in my book that personal devotion to the Pope is not a virtue, but a pestilence afflicting and damaging the Church. Until the mid-19th century, even Catholics in the central Italian peninsula itself rarely had any idea of the name of the Pope of Rome. They certainly weren't accustomed to being hectored by him on Twitter or airplanes or inundated by daily homilies and an annual barrage of encyclicals, letters, motu propria, canons, exhortations, and the rest of the exhausting curio caravan of loquaciousness and micromanagement. Catholics going forward need to free themselves from all this, need to free themselves from this infantile deference to and reliance on the Pope, and indeed on all other so-called father figures in the Church. A father, by his most basic definition, is one who gives life. But too many so-called fathers in the Church have taken and destroyed life by abusing victims and covering that up. Deference, continued deference when we know this, to such men is clearly a species of what Freud called moral masochism, which typically involves the placing of the self at the disposal of impersonal powers, he writes, such as the clergy. That must end. No longer must Catholic faithful consider themselves under the clergy, nor required to obey them as their superiors. That is both bad theology and worse psychology. Following the hugely important ecclesiological work of Nicholas Afanasiev, I propose a further change in the book that is both structural and psychological. To see the Church as composed of and conjointly governed by three orders: the hierarchs, bishops, the clerics, parish clergy, and the laïcs, as Afanasiev calls them. The term laïc is a calque, which Afanasiev borrows from the Greek. He does so to get away from the problematic term lay. These are not equivalent terms for Afanasiev. He calls them laïc, borrows this term from the Greek, as I mentioned. Why? Because he says to call somebody a lay person is to indicate that they lack something. I have a layman's take on cancer from Googling it, which is different from that of an oncologist, right? An oncologist, we would say, is not a layman. He's a professional. He's got certain qualifications, degrees, credentials, training, expertise, and so on. A lay person has none of that. But that's bad theology, because the Church is not a professional society of experts. And lay people lack none of the standing of the clerics and the hierarchs. For all are baptized into the one priesthood of Jesus Christ, and thus all are fundamentally equal. It seems to me, in conclusion, it's time for us to begin to act as such, to act as though all three orders within the Church are equal, and for the laïc to return to and reclaim this role. Not least, in conclusion, I would say, to forestall the long and merciless arm of Caesar. What do I mean by that? Well, we're already seeing in places like California and Australia attempts by governments to interfere in the very life of the Catholic Church. If the Church won't reform, then Caesar might do it for us. And our dear and beloved sisters in this room know in their bones, as the entire community of the Sisters of St. Francis of Perpetual Adoration does in their history, that that's not a good thing. When the Iron Chancellor of Prussia, von Bismarck, decided to turn his face against the Catholic Church, we gained because we got sisters in this country. But at what a cost to the church in Germany. Do we want to see that again? In some ways, that horse may have already bolted. The number of inquiries and reports being conducted by attorneys general across the country is growing. If we don't want the tender mercies of Caesar interfering in the life of the church and in undertaking reforms on our behalf, is it not time for us to start thinking about doing that ourselves? That concludes my sort of prepared remarks. I wanted to leave it on the short side precisely to encourage discussion, which, whether I'm giving or listening to a lecture, is always the most interesting part for me. And because, as I suspect, what I've said and what I propose in the book will indeed arouse some questions, so I am at your disposal. Thank you.
I appreciate very much the candor of your presentation. I wonder if there isn't a danger, though, in focusing too much on sins committed by other people. I'm going to have to give an accounting to God of the way that I've lived the life that I received from God. I don't have to give an accounting of how other people have lived their lives. What would you say to someone who raises an objection of this sort?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to say. It's an important and not uncommon argument that I've heard. In one sense, it's totally unobjectionable because I think it's sort of basic theology. That the church is a communion, we're bound up with each other, but we also bear individual responsibility. But at the same time, I would be cautious around, if not critical of, pressing that claim too far, precisely because I've heard it used time and time again as a way of forestalling any real change. And so what you get then is to say, well, yes, sins were committed, right? Things were done. People have done terrible things, but we're all sinners. Who of us is to judge, right? That is too often used, I think, as a way of avoiding responsibility by those who bear it in particular and acute fashion. And so I think, yes, on the one hand, we all do give an account for our lives, but on the other hand, good theology would say none of us is saved by ourselves. We are living in not just the communion of grace, which is the church, but we live almost in a sense, you could say, a communion of sin too. And that's not my own idea. That's from, I forget which paragraph it is, but it's a very powerful paragraph in Reconciliatio et Penitentia, which John Paul wrote in 1984 on structures of sin and the nature of sin in the church, in which he talks about the fact that there is, he says, no such thing as a private or an individual sin. He said every sin has implications for the entire human family and the whole world. And so, yes, on the one hand, we bear individual responsibility, but that responsibility is bound up with each other. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to challenge, not just ourselves, but each other, and to challenge, especially if that claim is being used, as I have heard it time and again, to avoid doing anything. I mean, Robert Barron's book, for example, that's its basic premise right there. So, well, we're all sinners, so really, I mean, let's just pray and fast a bit more, and that's enough. No, it's not enough. And calls for prayer and fasting and repentance that are only expressed in individual terms, I think, are not only a betrayal of the church as a communion, but also, as I say, a way of avoiding responsibility for doing things in concrete ways, if that helps at all. Okay.
Very provocative presentation. And I just want to, I guess, two questions. The first question is, the proposals that you are putting forth, have they worked in responding to the problem that prompted you to make those proposals in the past? Is there some way that we can judge to say these won't be problems if in fact we adopt your proposals? That's the first question. And then the second question is, who do you expect to buy into your revolutionary proposals in order for them to be adopted?
Yeah. the easy and perhaps flippant answer to the second question is almost nobody. I think for a lot of people it is, and a good friend of mine, whom some of you in this room know, former student here in fact, said to me, he read drafts of the book, he said, most people aren't going to want to do this because it's going to require they actually do something, right? And require that things be changed. And most of us are kind of lazy and we like things just to kind of stay the way they are. So major change, that's major work. And how many of us want to sign up for that? So yeah, I think I don't expect that this is going to get an easy or an instant reception. That said, I still would stand absolutely by the proposals, even if there were no crisis, because I don't think the system is justified historically or theologically right now. So even if we took the whole crisis off the table, even if the church were just perfect, I would still argue as firmly for the changes I propose, because I think they're justified by the theology of the church. Your first question about evidence is a really good one and a really important one, and I'm happy to be able to say the book does have a number of kind of case studies, as it were, in which I show where the proposals not only have worked, but are working right now. And so basically what the book is in some ways is kind of a tour of global Christianity to say, there are other parts of the Christian world outside of the Catholic Church where these systems have worked very well and are working today. And so the primary examples I draw on are from the Oriental and Byzantine Orthodox churches. The big one that I feature quite extensively is the Armenian Church. The Armenian Church, and this kind of continues my love affair with the Armenian Church that I wrote about in my first book. The Armenian Church structures have, I think, the best approach of any apostolic church on the planet, including the other Orthodox churches. The Armenian Church has lived local accountability, in part because if you know the history of Armenia and the kind of the shattering of Armenia after the Arab invasions in the 640s, you basically had Armenians scatter into the North Caucasus on the one hand and towards the Black Sea on the other. And so these are people separated from any sort of centralized universal leader like a pope, and they have to figure out how to make their communities survive and live through horrendous persecution and massive bloodshed. So the Armenians have worked on this for a long time, and it'd probably bore most of you to death, but I actually go through a lot of their canons and their statutes in some detail to show how they run their parishes, how they run their dioceses, how they run their regions, and how they elect what they call their Catholicos, which is their kind of universal head, who is based in Etchmiadzin, just outside of the modern political capital of Yerevan. So the Armenians are the ones that I really feature a lot. There are some other examples from other Orthodox churches, the Greeks, the Russians a little bit, and then especially the Orthodox Church of America here. Their statutes, I have argued elsewhere for a number of years now that those have a lot of wisdom Catholics could benefit from also. Perhaps a slightly more controversial example that I use, but there's good reason I argue in the book for, is to look at one that's very well known and intimately so for me, and that's the Anglican Diocese of Huron, which is the jurisdiction that basically hugs the lake of that name in southwestern Ontario, where I grew up. And that's a system of local accountability that is, in fact, quite similar to the Armenians, and has, I think, worked very well in holding clergy accountable and granting the laics their rightful place in the councils of governance of the church. So yeah, there's case studies there, there's evidence. That said, I would just add this as a final note. No system is perfect, right? And in fact, one of the things I stress in the book is that Catholics above all should know that no system is perfect. We have, if you will, kind of a trademark or a copyright on this thing we call original sin, right? And ordination does nothing to take that away. And so we build a system that allows men marked by original sin basically unchecked power, and then we're kind of surprised when they abuse it. And so I say, you know what? Let's change the system, not because we're interested in muscling them aside, not because we think you guys are bad and we do want to cut your heads off, although that's sometimes a temptation, but because we love you, right? Tough love. If you really love somebody that you know has a problem, when you came out here tonight, you probably took the keys from the liquor cabinet and brought them with you, right? You didn't leave your Uncle Bob at home knowing that he has a weakness, because that's not loving. And so that's part of what I say in the book is, let's look at these other systems that know how to love their clergy enough to hold them accountable and not give them opportunity to exploit unchecked power. I don't know if that helps. Okay.
I was wondering if you see the structure as it is now being a result of geopolitical events over history, and you mentioned Vatican I, and I thought of, in that time period, the church and state issues and nations, and to what extent does the church, in determining power structure, respond to or react to what is going on geopolitically?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and thank you for that. And I do go into detail about that in the book, because you cannot understand Vatican I and everything that follows from it until you understand the French Revolution. And not just the French Revolution, but all of the major European revolutions of 1848. So you've basically got a 70-year period, roughly, in which the church is changing structures precisely as a reaction to geopolitical events. I mean, it's hard for us, I think, to appreciate just how traumatizing the revolution was for the church in France. I mean, the church was shattered. The church was just shattered. I mean, when Napoleon comes along in 1800, 1801, after the revolution, he sacks the entire French episcopate. And he goes to Pope Pius VI and then Pius VII and says, either you appoint these guys or I'm going to. And that's the first time in history where popes step in to make major episcopal appointments across the board. Now, I look at that today and say, we cannot have that anymore. But I also say in the book, that made sense in 1801. When you're basically over a barrel or you're back to the wall and you've got somebody like Napoleon who says, either you appoint these guys or I'm going to put them in. And he wasn't just going to put them in, he was going to rearrange the dioceses and help themselves to whatever property he wanted and so on. So, the Pope's hand is kind of forced because of geopolitical changes like the Revolution and like the advent of Napoleon. But we're not in 1801 anymore, right? We're 200 plus years out from that. And I published an article this summer, and what I argued in that was, it's time to let go of those traumatic memories. Because I think it is, in a real sense, a trauma for the church. It was to live through the French Revolution. And in some ways, the Catholic Church only began to kind of heal from that, many people have argued, at Vatican II in the 1960s, right? Almost 200 years after the French Revolution. So we've long since moved past the geopolitical situation in which you've got people like Napoleon trying to muscle in and take over on the question of diocesan boundaries and property and leaders. But the church hasn't moved on, right? The model we have today is stuck in the 19th century as a reaction to Vatican I. And I think that's a real problem. We've got to say, look, that's a moment that is past. And that kind of moment is not going to happen again. We'll have different moments. We have other challenges today. I mean, Chinese interference, for example, into episcopal appointments is an issue, right? But that's a different kind of interference in a different context from what France was. And never mind China, what about the rest of the world, right? England, Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Latin America. These are not places where you've got, by and large, dictators trying to interfere in the life of the church. So the papacy needs to stop acting like that. The papacy is, in a sense, in a kind of a perpetual, and again, this makes sense. If you understand trauma psychology, this makes a lot of sense. The papacy is in this kind of perpetual crouch, right? This defensive posture because when's the next blow coming, right? Who's going to invade us and kill us next? And so we've got to reserve the power to move in and appoint leaders after some dictator lobs off the last of them. But again, we've got to say, look, come on, right? Move on, get over it. We're not in 1801, we're not facing Napoleon, we are no longer facing that kind of geopolitical challenge. We have different challenges today. I think, last thing I'll say, I think slowly, for all the problems, I think slowly Pope Francis is moving us in that direction. I think he sees that we're no longer in that moment. And so all of this talk, which has got a lot of problems I could go on in length about, all this talk about synodality that he's brought forward, however messy that is at least a halting attempt on his part, I think, to move beyond this centralized model as a reaction to the French Revolution.
There just seems to be kind of an odd amount of these abusers condensed within the church. Do you think that that's mostly just because abuses of the church are really especially put under a microscope, or because possible of just the opportunities that these men in power get, or do you think that there's just kind of like a separate different reason for why there seems to be just such a crazy amount of abuse between those in the holy ranks?
Yeah, really good question. Short answer is I think I would say yes to all of the above. Yes, there is a lot, but yes, some of that is the scrutiny that it gets that perhaps may magnify that in some ways. A couple things that may be helpful to recall here. The Catholic Church is the largest religious body on the planet, right? Last numbers I saw for 2018, we're looking at about 1.6 billion people who claim to be Catholic on the planet. So that's a lot of people. And within that, of course, on a proportional basis, you're going to have, a number of abusers. It does help not to let people off the hook, but it does help for comparative purposes to realize that there are abusers in all kinds of systems and traditions. There's been a number of reports of abuse in, for example, Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn. We hear stories even today of abuse in, public schools in Indiana, Protestant clergy. It's something that's found everywhere. I don't say that to relativize the uniqueness of the Catholic situation, because I think, as you hinted at the end, there are some, some unique factors within the church that contribute to this. And one of them is precisely the lack of accountability. Slowly, painstakingly, most other institutions today have found ways of building in safeguards. You've got, if you listen to the radio, anytime in the last 2 weeks, of course, what are we hearing about? Impeachment, whistleblowers, that kind of thing. There's no whistleblower system in the Catholic Church, right? There's no 1-800 line you can call and talk to somebody about this. Again, very, very strange, because the church is supposed to be committed to the proclamation of the truth. We're supposed to be committed to the open search for the truth, and we specialize in secrecy and closing things up and denial and deflection and not telling the truth of what happened, right? And some of that, I think, is aided by the structures of the church, where that's just simply not forced out. We have, again, this kind of magical thinking that says, well, these men have had hands laid on their head, right? They're in holy orders, so they would never do stuff like this, right? You think of the early reactions in the when some of this stuff started coming out in the early 1980s in Canada. I would say 95% of Catholics dismissed it. Like, no, these are holy men. They're in holy orders. Father so-and-so, he's practically a walking saint. There's no way he could have done that, right? So we have this, this expectation that we don't need structures because these men are just kind of destined to be holy from the beginning. That's a unique factor you don't find when you're talking about public school teachers or Jewish rabbis or Protestant clergy or, basically any other category.
My experience is when you find an abuse and you go and the priest sees it with you and tells you it's abuse, agrees that it is abusive, and then you try to get the priest to go with you to the bishop, and they will not do anything because they're afraid of losing their retirement or reprimand or counseling or whatever they're going to do to them. and then you're left holding the bag and nothing changes. And that's been going on in Fort Wayne for 30 years.
Yeah, and that is, and I've heard that from clergy myself, right? We don't report certain things because we know the blowback is going to get me.
So how do you get by that?
Well, and that's not an easy problem. And again, I think that has to be a structural change across the board, in which people no longer have the choice. That this stuff has to be done, and there have to be structures in place to protect the people that do it. Because power always wants to protect itself and its perks and its privileges, and that is true in the church as in any other institution. So knowing that, we have to build in ways that people can come forward and honestly report these things and not be, hung out to dry. How we do that, I don't know. That's something I think that requires more thought and more development. But that we do it is indisputable as far as I'm concerned. Because yes, that has happened time and again. Something is told to somebody, a letter's put in a file somewhere in the secret archives, and that's the end of the matter, right? There's nothing done beyond that. And it's usually only, if it comes out, in the media or public scrutiny, that then bishops are kind of forced to act. Why, if you knew it in the first place from one of your own, would you have not done that? I think we have to kind of take that option away and say, yeah, if you're not going to report stuff, then we're going to alter structures and systems such that you no longer have that option. And there will be ways in which, and I don't know how it would devise these, it would require some careful thought and would probably vary from region to region in light of relevant civil law, for example. But there have to be ways to remove that possibility of cover-up and basically force people out into the open. I mean, that's really kind of the title of the book, Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed. Let's close off the hiding places where the men who have stashed this stuff and not changed have been allowed to kind of lurk for too long.
So I've heard it said before that part of this problem is because of a result of the seminaries and the changes implemented by Vatican II in the United States. And I've also heard that since then we've had major changes to seminary entry and that we're kind of starting to weed those problems out. Do you think that's kind of a false claim of origin of these problems, or people think that these are legit but they don't know the real backstory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer to that has got to be mixed. Because yes, in some places I think there have been reforms to seminaries. I had a chapter in the first draft in the book on seminaries. I took it out because that, I think, deserves a kind of a special treatment of its own. But what I would say is this. I think some seminaries have cleaned up and are better places today. But just this week, in a 3-part story in the National Catholic Register, Peter Jesser Smith has been discussing in detail what's going on at Christ the King Seminary in the Diocese of Buffalo. Which really, forgive the cliche, is probably ground zero right now for the abuse in the church in this country. The situation in Buffalo is unbelievable. And what he's been reporting and disclosing is precisely the number of clergy there within the past year who have been sexually harassing or propositioning seminarians. We saw 2 seminarians from that seminary publicly quit this past summer and go public because they said, we have gone to the bishop and he's done nothing. And so they went to the media and they said, we have clergy, including the bishop's secretary at the time, this priest who was the secretary of the bishop, who has been harassing us, pressuring us into having sex, and we find this intolerable. We cannot be men devoted to the pursuit of holiness and the formation of ourselves when this is what we're facing on a daily basis. And so they resigned from the seminary and went public because talking about it to the bishop and to the seminary rector and staff got them nowhere. So yeah, Buffalo is clearly still a problem. Other seminaries, from what I've heard anecdotally, are in a lot better shape. So I think the answer to your question, Emma, in some ways is it depends where you are and what's been done. So I think there's progress. There's some signs of hope in some places, but clearly not everywhere. Does that okay?
Did Vatican II do anything positive?
Yes, absolutely. I've written for Oxford University Press a number of things on the good coming out of Vatican II. So I'll give you a quick answer. I think Vatican II made dramatic improvements in the relationship between the Church and the Jewish people. I think Vatican II made huge improvements in the relation between Catholics and the Orthodox churches and the Protestants on the other side. Those are some of the things I think I would place as clear, unambiguous goods coming out of the council. Other parts of the council, I would say, yeah, it's kind of ambivalent, and still other parts of the council, I would say, I think that was a mistake. I've always resisted the idea that you have to be a kind of a yes or no, black or white when it comes to councils or many other things. I think, as I just mentioned, there's lots of good coming out of Vatican II. I think, for example, if you ask me for something that's maybe not so good, I think the underlying sociology and anthropology of Gaudium et Spes is long past its sell-by date. In other words, I think the vision of humanity in Gaudium et Spes is limited to the 1960s, and that world doesn't exist anymore. There was a kind of a rosy optimism there that, we would get rid of nuclear weapons and solve, war and everybody have enough to eat and all that kind of stuff. The one area where I would be very critical, and I have been for a long time, is I think in the liturgy constitution. I think some of what the liturgy constitution tried to do makes a lot of sense and was very good. But I think some of the underlying vision there was questionable, and certainly the implementation after the council, not at the council but after, was hugely problematic. That's not an original view of mine. In saying that, I draw that directly from the writings of Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, who said that really the reforms led to some deeply disturbing damage in the church. And so in that regard, I think Vatican II has a lot to answer for.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very good. And I know you really believe what you have written and spoken. I was wondering, you said the diocesan level would be a place to start. Would you be willing to use this as a test area for your own ideas in Fort Wayne, South Bend?
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who's up in the Diocese of Milwaukee on that very question. And so he and I were kind of putting our heads together and thinking about, what are places where some of this might happen as a test case? We were thinking of bishops that we know or bishops that might be open to it, and there were about 3, 1 in Canada and 2 here. I'd love to talk to you more about this if you want, maybe afterwards or something. If people here are open to this, I'm certainly game to beginning that long work and putting that time and effort into sort of building something as a test case. One of the things I became very aware of after finishing the book is, especially in an age of social media, it's easy to pop off with some opinion about what should be done. And I think a lot of us think, well, that's really all I need to do, If I shout at somebody at Twitter and cause them to lose their job, well, then, my job well done, right? I've achieved something. But what if you've gone out and actually changed the conditions of the world and put in the time, right? I always joke, my grandmother, when I was a young kid, dragged me around to all these meetings and smoke, because you could still smoke in the 80s, smoky church basements with bad coffee out of styrofoam cups, and you talk about how we could kind of, do something better. That's not glorious work, but that's the kind of necessary sort of local work that needs to be done. So yeah, if there's openness here or anywhere else, count me in. Does that?
Yes, and I was wondering if you would be the one to lead this.
Well, I would certainly play whatever role people felt was useful. I would not want, I have an allergy to people being the only expert. I would not want to be that kind of person. I would want to have others, around that would also be involved. Because one of the things I've learned from Freud and my studies in psychology over the years is we all have blind spots, and I need other people to point those out to me, or in more concrete terms, I've spent almost 20 years as an academic editor. And I'll never forget, one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. We're a team of editors. We worked long and hard on this worship book, over 1,000 pages. It's the blue book that we use for divine liturgy, the Byzantine liturgy. Over 5+ years, and we'd all read that thing inside and out about 5 million times. And we get it back from the printer the first Sunday we go to use it, and one of my priest friends flips it open to one of the pages, and what do we see there, right glaring at the top in big bold letters? A major typo, right? So that's just my way of saying we need other people, and I'm happy to play whatever role, but with others who would be there as well. Tony.
Do you know why a lot of Catholic priests abuse their children? Do you know why they abuse their children?
I think, a lot of the answers to that question are going to vary from person to person. Some of them, it was a replication of what had been done to them. In fact, that's often the case, right? Many years ago, when I was working on an aspect of this crisis, I was reading old canons going way, way, way back, old canon law, and I discovered something that really shocked me. And I thought, how cruel, how unfair. There are very early canons in the church that say victims of abuse are themselves impeded from ordination. I thought, oh, that's terrible. That's like blaming the victim, right? How could we be so cruel as to say, well, this young boy was abused by the priest, so this boy, is no longer eligible to become a priest himself. But you know what? The church was ahead of the curve. Because one of the things we've realized, again, thanks to modern research, is how often abusers were themselves abused. And so one of the answers to that question, there are others, but one of the answers to that question is, why would priests abuse kids? In some cases, it's because they themselves were abused. And they were perpetrating, when Scripture talks about the sins of the fathers and the forefathers, yes, right, getting passed down to the 7th generation.
Yes, 7th generation.
Yeah, in a very literal way, that's what happened with some of these kids. They were victims of victims, in essence. There are other reasons, but I think that's an important one to kind of call out.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
You mentioned that your most radical proposal is changing the rule on celibacy. What's your thinking on that in general? What is it that brought you to that?
As I say, it's something I come to very reluctantly because it would involve major cost and major change. And I have many friends in the Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic churches who are married clergy, and it puts a huge strain on the marriage, oftentimes, and on the children. Because, dad is never around. I mean, here's the example I used I used it for 1,000 times. It's, 7 minutes after 8 o'clock tonight, right? And at 8:30, let's say, tonight, little Billy's got a late soccer practice, right? But in 10 minutes, Dad's cell phone rings, and it's Parkview Hospital, Mrs. Ancient Parishioner, who's been sick for 2 months, picks tonight to die, right? How unthoughtful of her. But where's Dad going, right? Because Dad's got to go anoint her, maybe hear her confession if she's still conscious, and give her the Eucharist, right? And so once again, Dad stiffs Billy and says, I know I've missed the last 3 practices and the previous 14 games. I'm sorry, I got to go. And so married clergy live a very difficult and a very sacrificial life. It's one thing for the man to bear the sacrifice, it's another thing for the women and the children. Why, knowing that, would I still argue for it? There was one moment where that kind of shifted for me, because I thought, no, that's even too radical for me. I'm not going to go down that path. But it shifted for me in June of last year, shortly after the McCarrick stuff broke. It was a lengthy report out of Los Angeles, I quoted in the book, in which, and we've subsequently seen this kind of language in other dioceses, but this is the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, right, which is the biggest diocese in the country. in which the bishops of that diocese and the vicars for clergy and others high up on record said, in reference to clergy who were known to abuse children, just move them into the parishes with all of the undocumented immigrants, because they're not going to complain. They're not going to go to the police, because if they go to the police, then they're going to, be put at risk for being deported. And so you read the language in there of how these bishops wanted to respond to these priests and these victims, and it's complete dehumanization. They do not exist as damaged, wounded children and human beings. They are a problem to be made to go away as fast as possible, with as small a check as possible, and a confidentiality agreement that you sign as well. And I thought, how can you not see these people as human beings? And for me, one of the answers to that question, and I don't claim it's the best answer or the perfect answer, but one of the answers to that question is, these are men who do not have children. In some cases, these are men whose own childhood was interrupted when at, about the age of 14, they're plucked out of home, sent off to a minor seminary, and then processed through this system in isolation for years before they're ordained. They don't see children as human beings because they don't see children at all. They don't have that relationship. And so for all of the challenges and struggles that marriage brings, it humanizes us. It forces us to look at these children not as an object ripe for abuse or as a problem made to go away with a check, but as human beings. And so I think that's one way to start to get bishops to think differently, is to be family men again. And here I quote, he said it somewhat jokingly, but he was also very serious. There was a much beloved Ukrainian Catholic bishop of Toronto, whom I knew slightly at the end of his life, Isidore Boretsky, who used to say, I have great confidence in my married clergy, because that man's wife is his bishop, archbishop, metropolitan, patriarch, and pope, all rolled into one. She's going to keep him in line, right? And if he's getting up to any funny business, she's going to know about it long before I hear about it. And so I thought, there's great wisdom in that. Now, again, we know married men commit stuff and their wives don't see it. I mean, we know all that. But on the whole, that system has more eyes on the guys, if you will, right? Wives and others keeping an eye on them and holding them to account, and allowing them to be more humanized by seeing children. I think, maybe I'm just an old softy at heart, but having kids myself, I read these stories and I'm just staggered by this stuff. I think, how could anybody look into the eyes of a child and then do this monstrous stuff to them? And I think, well, if you're not around kids, they don't exist as human beings to you, right? They're a label, they're a category, they're a problem to be made to go away. So that for me was one of the kind of the pivot moments in that last chapter, was saying, if these bishops, and we've subsequently seen this kind of language and approach in, for example, maybe you read the big report out of Pennsylvania, and in other reports, they don't exist as human beings in the eyes of bishops and the church's lawyers. They exist as a problem. And I thought, well, maybe you need to live with them. Maybe you need to have some of your own, and then develop that bond out of which compassion would motivate you to ensure that no other kid suffers, because you could see the eyes of your own children in the eyes of the victims. I don't know, I'll stop there. I don't know if that's...
Thank you, Adam, for sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. We thank him again.